we define immigrant integration as improved economic mobility for enhanced civic participation by and receiving society openness to immigrants. And within that, we have really had an intentional focus on African American communities from the beginning. We began in 2008. So we've done research looking at African American and immigrant communities, and really you see that as demographics are changing throughout the country, we see a lot of immigrants moving into African American communities, as well as a lot of African American. There's a really loud noise in the background. Sorry. And we see a lot of African American communities and immigrant communities moving out to suburbs together. And, we see a lot of common issues amongst African Americans and immigrants, and really feel like building alliances between the groups is critical to pushing for a more positive approach to immigrant integration. But we're really concerned because we think such a partnership is crucial to the broader mission of social justice. And we really cannot conceive of a world in which immigrant rights are protected if African Americans remain vulnerable to racial profiling and economic despair. So just quickly, there are two reports I'd recommend everybody read. I'm going to show you. One is written by us. You can get it on our website, called All Together Now. African Americans, Immigrants, and the Future of California, and the other is written by Baji. I don't know if you can see. It's called Crossing Boundaries, Connecting Communities, Alliance Building for Immigrant Rights and Racial Justice. Both papers were written and came out in about 2011, but they have really pertinent, they're still very relevant to issues today. So just quickly, a few of the major takeaways from those reports when thinking about building alliances between African Americans and immigrant communities are really to establish a cross-racial alliance building framework and be sure to bring African Americans into the immigrant rights movement, but also remember to bring immigrant communities into African American movements or racial justice movements. Often when we talk about partnering with African American communities, it has been to bring them into our work of immigrant integration, and then we don't always see the other way around. So we definitely like to highlight the importance of mutuality and really take time to build relationships and build trust within the different communities, and build work or campaigns around common issues like education and employment that are affecting all immigrant communities as well as African American communities. And then finally, be sure to incorporate Asian American immigrants and African immigrants into the work as well. We really need to make sure that we're not only focusing on Latino immigrants and work to make this an inclusive work. So with this presentation, I'm hoping Amaha is going to join us, but we hope to shed light on the real challenges and opportunities and some examples that are happening in New York, Michigan, and in California in some of our work. So we have three panelists. Amaha Casa, he's the founder and executive director of African Community Together. He's a first-generation Ethiopian immigrant with 20 years experience as a nonprofit director, social entrepreneur, and labor and community organizer. He was the director of East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy, a workers' rights research and advocacy organization up in the Bay Area in California. And he holds a law degree from UC Berkeley and a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School. And we have Vanessa Carter, who is a senior data analyst here at CSII and also our other organization, the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. Vanessa focuses her research, hi Amaha, good to see you. She focuses her research on immigrant integration, regional equity, social movements, and environmental justice. She received a master's degree in urban planning from UCLA and is a student at Fuller Theological Seminary, studying the intersection of grassroots social movements with Christian theology and organizing. And we have Christine Sauvé from from Welcoming Michigan. She's the Southeast Michigan Communities Coordinator. She is a multicultural community organizer working to connect U.S. and foreign-born residents in Metro Detroit. She received an MSW from the University of Michigan School of Social Work and previously served as a Peace Corps volunteer. So her work has made the Welcoming Michigan program into one of the most active in the Welcoming America campaign. So we are going to start with Omaha, and then we'll hear from Vanessa and Christine. And if you each can just do a few minutes to talk a little bit about your organization and how you yourself have come to this work. Omaha?
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. So yes, my name is Omaha Casa, and I'm the founder and executive director of African Communities Together, or ACT for short. We are an organization of and for immigrants from Africa. And we are based here in New York. Our offices are in the Bronx, but we work citywide. And we're actually in the process of developing a pilot project in Washington, D.C. as well. And we do three main things. One is that we help our community access services. We partner with government and nonprofit agencies to do information and referral. And the second strategy that we pursue is leadership development. We help African immigrants develop as leaders in their community through civic education, political education, leadership training, and we do that through our membership meetings and leadership trainings. And the last thing we do is that we advocate for structural and systemic change on the issues that affect African immigrant communities. Right now, there's three main areas where we're working. One is immigration, just and equitable immigration reform. The second is jobs, access to family-sustaining employment. And the third is language access to services for our community. And that's kind of a very brief snapshot. We can dig in deeper through the course of the conversation. My personal journey is I'm a first-generation Ethiopian immigrant. I was born in Ethiopia shortly before the revolution that toppled Haile Selassie's government, came to the U.S. as a asylum seeker, and have lived here as a first generation or 1.5 generation immigrant, and spent my career really working in community and labor organizing and working with very dynamic immigrant organizations from other communities. And at a certain point started to ask myself why there weren't more organizations serving families like mine, and decided that I was going to try to help bridge that gap.
Great, thank you. Vanessa?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on this webinar. Since Rhonda gave a really great overview of CSII already, I'm just going to mention a few partnerships and projects that we also have. At the local level, we work with the California Community Foundation to convene their Council for Immigrant Integration at the city level. We've been doing that for about 5 years now, so that's part of our local footprint. Statewide, we've worked with the California Immigrant Policy Center to produce contribution reports. So we've quantified how much immigrants contribute to the state of California at the county level and at the state level as well. And then nationally, we've worked with the National Partnership for New Americans to look at the fees for naturalization. So those are just some examples of the different sorts of projects we do at the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. There are others, but just wanted to mention those few. As for me personally, I came to this work, I don't know, I guess I was raised in a Lutheran church where my pastors were commonly going to El Salvador in the 80s. So there was a sort of DNA around justice and immigration and immigrants just in my life growing up. And then I spent a summer in Lincoln Heights, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, and was really affected by the kids there who we were tutoring at that time, and also at the same time learning a lot of different things theologically and being exposed to the real issues that were going on in our cities. And that got me into urban planning, and then eventually to work here. And I work and I live in the South LA area, so I've just been exposed to these issues, and also have a number of friends who are undocumented immigrants and their stories, and those relationships have affected me a lot.
Great, thanks. Christine?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be part of this important discussion. We think it's so critical to creating truly integrated communities where every community member can thrive. So the Welcoming Michigan Project is a statewide effort of the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. We are a member of Welcoming America, as Rhonda mentioned. And we work with communities across the state, community-based organizations, as well as local governments, so cities, counties, and townships, to help folks create a more immigrant-friendly climate, and at the same time, reaching out to receiving community members, longtime residents of the community who might have concerns or anxiety about how their neighborhoods or communities might be changing with the arrival of new immigrants or refugees. As Rhonda mentioned, I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, so what brought me to this work in some way, shape, and form was my experience abroad in West Africa and witnessing firsthand not only the reasons for migration and the push factors, but the dedication and desire that so many people around the world have to want to start a new life and take that leap here in the United States. So from wanting to have better education opportunities for their children, greater human rights protections or greater economic opportunity, that's something that all human beings share. And so I definitely connected with that in meeting folks in Africa. I'm also the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of immigrants, so personally I connect with the experience of migration and planting roots in a new place where you have to learn the language, start a business, or make your way in the world. And so I feel a personal connection to continue that process of welcoming for the next generation and current generation of immigrants. And then just finally, I'll note that growing up in the suburbs of Detroit and now living in the city of Detroit, I'm also keenly aware of the dynamics of white flight and racism and how that impacts the longtime residents in a mostly African-American city. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. So I'm going to start with a question for Amaha. Can you provide an overview of immigrant and Black identity in communities focusing on African immigrants? And what are some of the complexities when organizing around race and immigration?
Mm-hmm. So what we've found and what the social science literature shows is that in many ways, Black immigrant identity, African immigrant identity, like other immigrant identities, is really a 3-generation trajectory. I think of the first generation, those who've spent the bulk of their lives in their sending country, as kind of the homeland generation. People's identities were really shaped by the categories that they grew up with in their sending country, and so for some people, it's a big adjustment to American, the way that America thinks about race, identity, nationality. So, for example, for a lot of people, national identity, ethno-nationality, is not necessarily the most salient part of their identity in everyday life. It may be more salient which ethnic group they come from. They may come from an ethnic group like the Fulani that transcend national borders. Their religious identity or their linguistic identity may be more salient. And obviously, coming to America from countries that are overwhelmingly or predominantly Black, which is the experience of most immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa, race has a completely different valence for most African immigrants. It's people are aware of structural racism. They're aware. Most African countries have the experience of colonialism, so it's not as though racism is a novel concept. But the way that race plays out in everyday life, in interpersonal interactions, in the way that it affects people's professional aspirations, is a shock. And particularly when you consider the fact that most immigrants from Africa, just by virtue of the barriers and obstacles that they have to overcome to make it to the U.S. Are generally people who have been selected for, and often, as Denzel pointed out in the previous section, African immigrants have the highest educational attainment among immigrant groups, which is astounding and I think counterintuitive for a lot of people. And so in some ways, African immigrants fall off one of the biggest cliffs of social status when we come to the U.S. Often it's people who were not only relatively privileged in their home country, but often even within their own family, this was the person who the family invested in to try to send someone to go make money and send money home. Eldest children, eldest sons particularly. And then obviously African immigrants come to this country and find themselves at the bottom of the American racial hierarchy as both Black and immigrant. And that's a rude awakening many times. And that's the experience of the first generation. And so even over their lifetimes, often concepts about race, attitudes towards race, attitudes to whether race is an obstacle to achievement will evolve over the course of someone's lifetime. But the biggest shift is between the first generation and the second generation. Second generation African immigrants, like second generation immigrants from many other countries, have an identity that's both distinct from their parents, from people who were born and raised in other countries, and also very distinct from most other native-born, multi-generational Americans. In the case of African immigrants, distinct from multi-generational African Americans, the communities that have been here for centuries and descended, in most cases, from enslaved Africans. People have very different attitudes towards things like their understanding and relationship to American society, their understanding and relationship to their home country. And we see this not just in sort of abstract matters of identity, what people call themselves, but in terms of their outcomes educationally, professionally, and whatnot. And then by the third generation, the way that identity generally works in the U.S. is people are fully assimilated as Americans, and their origin tends to be less salient for the most part. And we can't see that as clearly with African immigrants because voluntary migration from Africa is relatively new. We've only really seen, the doors have really only been open for voluntary migration from Africa since about the 1970s. So there aren't too many third generation voluntary African immigrants. But we do see it very clearly with Afro-Caribbean communities. For example, I'm here in New York, where 28% of the African American community of Black New Yorkers are immigrants, and many of them Afro-Caribbean. And there's always been a back and forth between the West Indies and New York City. And we can see that in terms of who people marry, where people live, their attitudes towards American society, by the third generation, people are fully integrated. And so what my organization and other organizations are working towards is how do we affect the first and second generation so we affect the terms on which people integrate into American society, whether they integrate as empowered, civically engaged, economically advanced, members, or whether they integrate into the worst aspects of the American racial hierarchy. And so that's the challenge that lies before us.
That's really great. Thank you so much. I think the work you've been doing is really interesting and exciting, and I'm always interested in hearing more. For now, we'll move over to Vanessa. Can you tell us a little bit about the research you're doing in South LA, and if you can lift up any preliminary findings that are applicable to folks nationwide, that would be great.
Sure. Great learning from you. I've been hearing your name for a long time. So I'm happy to get the chance to talk about our project. This is definitely a team project of CSII. We are looking at South Los Angeles, also known as South Central in the past, and that's becoming a term being used again. So we're looking at South LA and Latino identity and how that may or may not be different from, say, Latino identity on the east side of Los Angeles, where there's a much stronger Chicano sort of identity. And we're looking at South LA and identity there to understand the future possibilities for coalitions between Latinos, Latino immigrants, and African Americans. So South Central is a neighborhood that is historically African American. It's been known for things like the Watts Rebellion in the 60s, the 92 civil unrest, the Rodney King incident happened there as well that led to that unrest. So this is a neighborhood that has a rich history, both of struggle and of a lot of success in terms of social justice, some really innovative community organizing coming out of South LA. But the demography is really changing there. So we're looking at 3 different areas in South Los Angeles to get a little bit of nuance, but overall in South LA, around the 2010 census, about 2/3 of the neighborhood was Latino and about 1/3 African American or Black. Now, when we looked at different neighborhoods in South LA, that was a little bit different. So historic South Central along Central Avenue is about 90% Latino, and half of that being immigrant Latino and half of that being native-born Latino, and about 10% Black. Then there's 2 other neighborhoods we're looking at. One is Vermont Square. This is an interesting neighborhood. It actually has the highest concentration of Central Americans among the Latinos there, and a large homeownership share as well. And then Watts. Watts is about 70% Latino and about 30% Black at this point. So the neighborhoods are different, and South LA is transitioning differently depending on what part folks are living in. But what's very clear is that this is a settled and settling Latino population. So homeownership is very common. We've heard stories of families buying houses all around a similar block. So there'll be maybe 4 houses that belong to the same Latino family in these neighborhoods. And about 43% of Latinos in South LA have lived in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. So this is definitely a settled and settling group. So we're finding demography has really changed at this point. What's less clear is how the institutions are going to change. So there are a lot of the schools on the more east side of South LA are now predominantly Latino, but on the west side and some of the ones on the south, Crenshaw High School is still 70% African American. Dorsey, near where I live, is about half African American. But that's not always the case. And in fact, Manual Arts, which is kind of in the heart of South LA, has the most Central American students, I believe, of any high school in the US. So there's a lot of differentiation. But what we do know is that there are separate fates. That's a possibility, and there's another possibility of seeing common fates of these 2 groups. So a separate fate version might look like Latino nationalism becoming the majority and working mostly around a Latino agenda when it comes to civic engagement and politics. That's one possibility, and we've heard that when we've interviewed civic leaders and when we've interviewed community folks. So we've interviewed almost 80 community residents at this point and about 15 civic leaders to try to understand these issues. What the really excited civic leaders are talking about is the possibility of connected fates and what it looks like to build a Latino-Black coalition moving forward. That's been the case in the past in South LA. And we're seeing that it can continue to be the case moving forward, but that's just not quite determined yet. What it could look like is building coalitions around issues like criminalization, education, labor. In each of these areas, they are common struggles, but there are nuances for the different population in both. And we're also hearing a lot of hopeful stories from the second generation in LA who have grown up with Black neighbors, Black schoolmates, and have real different sorts of intimacies with African Americans in their neighborhood. And they're returning to LA. Some of the second generation are going off to school and coming back to South LA because they love their neighborhood. And there's a sort of pride and love that's come to them through this kind of shared struggle in South LA. So we see a lot of hope for coalitions moving forward.
Great, thank you. And hopefully we'll have more time later to hear more. Christine, can you tell us a little bit little context or background on the particular context of Detroit and the changing demographics, but also your program is interesting in that really seems to have an intentional focus of both uplifting both the long-term residents as well as the new Americans. So can you please tell us more?
Sure. So Detroit is 82% African American, and 34% of residents are at the poverty rate. So historically, though, Detroit was once a strong immigrant gateway. So in the mid 1800s to late 1800s, that reached a peak at one point of almost 50% of the residents were foreign born. Now jump to today, and that number is at 5%, which is lower than our state average of 6% and much lower than the national average of 12 or 13%. But many of the cities in the suburbs have higher concentrations of foreign-born individuals. Now, that said, when you look at Detroit, 5% translate, it's still our largest city in the state, so that 5% translates into about 36,000 residents, which is still a large number, especially compared to other Midwest cities. The majority of our residents come from Mexico and Latin America. We have a strong Mexican town in Southwest Detroit, and that has been there for a long time. That's a very settled population, but there's more newcomers coming from Latin America. Then we also have folks from Yemen, Bangladesh, and Iraq. Smaller populations, but still present in different neighborhoods in the city. And we also have a Caribbean and small West African population. The majority of the African immigrants actually live in the suburbs and are somewhat dispersed. So sometimes they're not as visible to the community here. I will add also that 13% of Detroit's immigrants are Black, so coming mostly from the Caribbean, but also some of our Cuban and immigrants from Central and South America. So our goal is to create immigrant-friendly environments where all members of the community are honored and respected and included. And so we do this by reaching out to longtime residents to engage them in that process of welcoming. Can you hear me all right?
There is a loud noise in the background, but we can hear you.
Okay, that's much better. So in that process, we have to truly honor and recognize the resilience of so many of our African American residents in Detroit who have really endured and experienced some difficult times through the years of white flight and disinvestment, and then into cultural and physical segregation, and now in the years of post-bankruptcy where we're seeing really heightened development. And so thinking about what that looks like in terms of potential for gentrification or displacement of residents. We also have a high vacancy rate, so sometimes folks don't think that gentrification can happen in the city, but we are seeing it to some degree in some of the denser neighborhoods in downtown and midtown where more of the development projects have been concentrated. So because of the cultural and physical segregation that has happened in Detroit and with suburbs, part of what we need first is connect residents and help neighbors to each other. So they're physically segregated. Sometimes it's cultural. With a proliferation of charter schools, students aren't always integrated in the same school setting. So there's an extra barrier there to helping folks get to know each other. And so part of our work relies on social contact theory and bias intervention strategies that show the more folks are able to get to know each other, the greater interest they'll have in a shared and connected fate and shared future. So we work with local leaders to develop different opportunities to bring folks together. And some of that involves creating joint projects that folks work on together. And sometimes it's through a storytelling event. So when we do storytelling, we highlight the stories of immigrants and refugees who share their experiences and their journeys coming to the United States. And we also highlight the migration experiences of African Americans. So we create a unified setting around the experience of migration. And so African Americans will share their stories, their family story of moving north from from the southern states. And then we talk openly about how they were either welcomed when they came to the north or how they weren't welcomed, and break that down a little bit to see how we can change things for the current generation of newcomers and those who might come after. So some exciting ways that we've been able to do that recently in Detroit include working on a municipal ID project. So that's been an excellent way to create a coalition of different communities that are impacted by lack of identification. So including African American seniors, homeless individuals, members of the transgender community, along with undocumented immigrants that make up our community here. I'm going to pause there just to make sure that we have time for the following questions.
Yeah, great. That's so interesting. I know that we're coming soon to the Q&A part, but since Denzel hasn't chimed in yet, can you each just give a really solid, specific example of a challenge or an opportunity or both that in this work that you've seen in your work? And anyone who wants to start, I'd say Amaha.
Okay. I think building unity is always a challenge. It's at many different levels, right? Building unity within the African immigrant communities where we're working across lines of ethno-nationality, language, religion, so forth, and then building unity at multiple levels with native-born African American communities, with other immigrant communities. That's always a challenge. But I would say that an opportunity is, when we're trying to mobilize and engage the African immigrant communities that we work with in a broader movement for equity and fairness for immigrants. People are aware. People watch what's happening on the news. People watch what's happening in their communities, and they look at the struggles of the immigrant rights community, of the immigrant rights movement and the civil rights movement, and they are inspired. And we say, we talk, for example, about the mobilization of the Dreamers and undocumented youth, and being in the streets holding signs saying undocumented, unashamed, unafraid, and that is so far from the reality in most of the African immigrant communities where we work, where there's still huge stigma and silence around issues of documentation. So being able to say, what's different? What's different? Why are we not there? And how can we be inspired by those struggles? And similarly with the struggles of the American Civil Rights Movement for racial equity, even engaging our members now in conversations about Black Lives Matter, and we have very difficult conversations, about that. But I think people hold two different ideas in their mind. They understand that they need to struggle collectively, but everything is so focused on the individual struggles that they're going through, and so it's a process and it's an evolution. But I would say there are opportunities as well as challenges.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, do you want to talk about some of the opportunities that are coming out of South LA?
Sure. So I kind of hinted at this before, but there's a handful of issues that sort of affect both Latino immigrants and Blacks in South LA and across the nation as well. So criminalization, so for Latinos, that tends to be more around deportation. For African Americans, more around incarceration. Education affects both communities. Labor, problems with labor and working affect both communities. So for Latinos, that tends to be more of an issue of working poverty. For African Americans, it tends to be more of an issue of unemployment. So the challenge there is to gloss over the differences, of course, or to create a coalition that focuses on, say, just working poverty and doesn't also include unemployment. But the opportunity there is to work into these conflicts and build community and trust through them and through working through them, and having a full progressive agenda that is supportive of both communities.
Great, thank you. And Christine, the other day you mentioned that in part of your work, you're making sure that to highlight how everyone makes important contributions to the community. Can you talk about that work a little bit more?
Sure. So when we talk about immigrants coming to intervention, because we're in an attraction place, because we are looking to include more immigrants in the city. So sometimes what goes along with that can be a concern about, well, what about the longtime residents? Are there going to be special assistance provided to immigrants that won't be provided to the longtime residents? And so through that process, we talk about how the longtime residents are the ones who've, held down the neighborhoods, during the difficult years here. And there's a lot of Black-owned businesses. We put a lot of attention on our immigrant entrepreneurs because they are, the statistics show they're 3 times as likely to own a business in Michigan. But we also have a strong history of Black-owned businesses in Detroit, so honoring and uplifting that as well. There's some challenges certainly in this work, but at the neighbor-to-neighbor level, you can really see the hope and the chance for opportunity there. Through some of our partners that work in Southwest Detroit, where the community is very mixed, with folks from Yemen, folks, from white or Appalachian communities living next to the longtime African American residents, along with newcomers from Central and South America. There's challenges around what do we do during Ramadan when we have a youth project that we need to work on? How do we handle issues around the young people sitting next to each other when in the Yemeni community, it's typically gender segregated. And our neighborhood organizations are really working through those discussions and coming out with a stronger community. So the residents are turning to each other to address issues around blight and crime and security. We hear stories of, for example, there was a young Black man who had always wondered about his neighbor from Yemen and took the steps to get to know him and learn how to say a few words in Arabic to greet him. So those are small examples, but they go a long way in creating a climate of culture where folks are working together.
Great, thank you so much. I believe we have some questions from Denzel.
We do. I think building coalitions is something we're going to talk about, building allies in the next module. And I wanted to find out, Rhonda, you can direct this to whomever you think would answer it best, but how do you go about building coalitions around this kind of integration, especially when you have, as Christine described, the old residents versus the new residents? How do you go about building allies toward your goals? Who are the people you collaborate with? What are the issues around which you collaborate, like labor or whatnot? Perhaps you can describe some of these things.
Christine, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the way we operate, and this is the model we use, is that we work with local leaders to assess what the community needs and work to uplift and support those networks of local leaders working together. So I would first and foremost recommend that people start by building those relationships with community leaders and expanding your definition of who is a community leader. That can include residents and parents, as well as your typical leaders of nonprofits and members of your local unions. Then once you have those leaders who are comfortable with each other, there's trust there, they are strong in their partnership, then they can work together to plan activities to address those community needs, and out of that forms a coalition. So right now we have a coalition sort of forming around the issue of municipal IDs. So we have members coming again from the homeless community, from the transgender community, from the undocumented community, all coming together to work on that issue. So that's my recommendation for starting.
Great. Amaha, did you have anything to add?
I guess I would just say that community-like identity is layered, and people have multiple communities: communities at work, communities at home, communities of worship, and for us, we really find that building a strong foundation within communities is essential to building coalitions and alliances across communities. If we're not organized as African immigrants, we can't meaningfully collaborate with other Black immigrants, with native-born African Americans, as part of the immigrant rights movement, as part of the civil rights movement. So far from being divisive, organizing within our community is what gives us the strength to come together across communities. And it's really, as Christine said, I think, and Vanessa as well, a matter of identifying the overlaps between our circles. What are the issues that are of common concern? How do we give equal weight to those concerns? As you said, Rhonda, it's a matter of not just saying we want to work together, meaning we want you to support our work, but understanding how we can build mutual gains.
Great. And Vanessa, did you want to talk a little bit about maybe dealing with anti-Blackness and some of that kind of work that we're seeing?
Yeah, so we're hearing coming up in our community interviews and our civic leaders interviews the importance of Blackness and also the effects of anti-Blackness. So with first-generation immigrants to South LA, some of them moved to South LA around 92 when there was the civil unrest, and brought with them some preconceptions about race coming to Los Angeles. So we've heard the second generation telling their parents, hey mom, hey dad, you're acting in a kind of racist way there. So there's this theme around anti-Blackness that's come up in particular around first-generation Latinos, but then on the other hand, their kids have such close friendships with the Blacks in their neighborhood that there's a lot of love and much more nuanced understanding of race and Blackness.
Are there other questions, Denzel?
Yes, so one just came in from Arkansas. I guess everyone can see it. Each region is different, and I guess none of you is from the Deep South. But in terms of organizing with the Latino population on issues, knowing the language is one thing, but you have to go so far beyond that. Maybe Vanessa can talk about reaching out to the Latino community in the context of what she's heard in the survey results, perhaps, the interview results.
Well, I can actually say a little bit from another project, but I think maybe another person might have more to say. We did a project with a historically Black church in LA, and they were their neighborhood was 90% Latino at that point, and they didn't know really how to connect with their neighborhood because most of their congregation was actually commuting from half hour, 45 minutes away on Sundays. So this organization approached us, asked us to do some data work for them, and we connected them with a local, mostly Latino serving community group. And together they did community surveys and started building bridges with each other and then getting to know the neighborhood as well. And that was one way that this church was making an effort to try to understand their changing neighborhood.
Yeah, so partnering with organizations that are working with immigrant communities is a way to reach out to new populations. Christine or Amaha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add that I don't know the race identity of the questioner, but sometimes that can play into what might be happening in terms of the success with organizing. Okay, thanks. I just see that now. With organizing with adults, really building trust is so incredibly important, and it's a slow process sometimes. There are fruits at the end, so it's worth it to hang in there. But I would start by sitting down and meeting with some of the immigrant communities in your area. So whether it's through their church or place of worship, or maybe there are community organizations that you can connect with as a starting point, and then talking to as many folks as you can to, again, you have to build your credibility in the community and sort of earn their trust and respect. Once you have that, then you can start to look at ways to organize and work together. But it's a slow process in terms of entry into the community and earning that.
If I could just add, I mean, I think that's so critical, that long, slow process of building trust. I mean, the amount of time that I've spent going to these community celebrations and, sort of sitting on the podium and having conversations with folks, being invited to, church services and mosque services at Ramadan. And, it's just, at a certain point, it's not anything that you say the first time that you show up. It's about the third time that you show up and the fifth time that you show up. And linguistic competence is really important. We're here in New York, and New York has very progressive language access policies. They actually don't reach our community. French is not one of the city's priority access languages, even though it's the most common shared language among Africans after English. And of course, none of the indigenous African languages are represented either. But it's not just language; it's culture. It's understanding, norms. It's understanding the networks and structures. Understanding how you reach people, and those things are gained with time. And then I would add to that, those things are no organization. We're a small organization. We have a core staff of 4. No organization is going to have all that competence in-house. We could never speak all the hundreds of languages of the African continent. We could never understand, all the subtle nuances and difference between, people from different parts of the country, or, sometimes from neighboring parts of the country. The way that we reach that is by recruiting leaders and by asking our leaders, our volunteers, our members, the community associations that we partner with, we ask them to take leadership and we ask them to communicate. And we start by understanding what they need, and most of them want to help their members. Most of them want to help them integrate and advance. And so it's an exchange. And I think we have to start by valuing the resources that are already in the community in order to effectively connect our communities with outside resources as well.
And I would just say one last thing. I think that really trying to convince funders that this work is important for both the benefit of immigrant communities, but also communities overall. So really investing dollars in the long process of building relationships, in creating the opportunity to have translation or interpretation at meetings. That's expensive to have someone there interpreting while a meeting is going, or having someone there, but really lifting this up as an important way to increase the contributions and benefits of all of our communities, I think will be really, really important. Denzel, are we running out of time, or do we have?
Yeah, we are, and I want to be mindful of the time of the very last presenter, but I was hoping there are some questions about addressing tensions, about building solidarity. We've been talking about trust. And perhaps as a good segue into our messaging module, perhaps each of you can give, just 10 seconds of how do you in your community, at the community level, encourage a new narrative on immigration within the context of where you work.
And Vanessa? Oh.
Well, I'm going to reiterate what Rhonda and I have been saying in a way. It's just that whenever we do immigrant integration work, we always are sure to include both African immigrants as well as African Americans and what it means to be in solidarity.
And I would say it really starts with the communities where we work. That it's really that unity is built in concentric circles, and that's how we start. We start with building unity within the communities where we work, and American society pushes people together. So it's really building on that process that's naturally occurring.
Say again, we rely on our community leaders to really help us do this work, and then they serve as champions for the messages moving forward. So the more that you engage your elected officials and your respected community leaders to carry the message forward of inclusion, then the more that it will be well received by community members. So that's what we recommend.
And I'll just say one thing as the moderator, just I think also being mindful that your issue that you're fighting for isn't in direct conflict with your neighbor's issues. So really trying to make the work a mutual benefit to the whole community.
Perfect. So I think on that note, that very positive and encouraging note, we can end up a conversation among experts. Thank you very much to Amaha Casa in New York, to Vanessa Carter in Los Angeles, Christine Solve in Detroit, and to our expert moderator and dear friend, Rhonda Ortiz in Los Angeles. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise.